Hey guys, see we got some people on already. Do me a favor, sign in. You know the deal. If you want your extra credit, you got a question, comment, answer, something. And this will be our last nighttime one for the year. All right, we'll start in just a minute. Give to everybody time to sign in. I got a couple different ideas. Um, Helena, do me a favor, send me an email. Let me know how you made out, please. And I know I said checks and balances, and we can do that if that's what you guys really want. But I did finish up the last Google slide, and I thought it might be a nice change up. I kind of went period by period. I gave some not comprehensive, not all inclusive, not every bit, but some examples of pop culture, books, other types of references that you could use for contextualization. I also did a quick, again, not perfect, not all inclusive, but a list of like some connections you could make, from one time period to the other to help you get that extra analytical point. Um, so again, sign in. It's not snowing. It's kind of funny. I was talking to my wife at dinner time, and I said, "Yeah, towards the end of the school year, I'll do these AP reviews. I'll sit outside. It'll be nice." And no, maybe it'll be nice by summertime. All right, I see we've got a dozen people on. I'm going to wait just another minute. Again, I'm going to use a PowerPoint, a Google slide, or whatever you want to call it. It's called Historians, Books, Pop Culture, and Other Stuff for Context and Outside Information. So if you want to access that, it's up on the classroom. I sent you guys an email. I'm going to offer a Zoom review session tomorrow at 10. That'll be the only thing tomorrow. We got that half day thing. And then I'm going to offer one on Friday at 10 a.m. as well, in case anybody wants it. And that's totally optional. It can be for last minute questions. It can also just be, hey, let's talk and, chill out and everybody catch our breath. Maybe, I don't know, we'll do Zoom yoga or something. Can you imagine me doing yoga? Okay. So we're going to get started in just a minute, guys. And as I've been doing for the last bunch of nights, I'm coming at you from my 6-year-old's bedroom because it's too cold to go outside. And it's just about the only quiet place left in the house. How do you know it's quiet? That's Maya. She's been asleep. Okay. Figure if the cat knows that it's quiet enough, then, it'll work. Okay. So before we start tonight, 2 nights before the test, do you have any questions in general? Okay. I usually say questions at the end, but I'm sure by then we're all tired because I know I am. So let's start off tonight with questions. Are there topics that you're concerned about? Are there questions, clarification you need about, doing hippos and stuff for your documents. Again, guys, give me what you want. You're my clients. I want to make you happy. So if you have any questions about anything, there is no such thing as a dumb question. I'll stop rocking while I'm holding the camera. My wife says that's going to make everybody seasick. Send me your questions. And if I see them pop up on the screen, I'll kind of try to hold my train of thought, and I'll do those questions as early as we can. Okay? So again, I'm asking you to sign in and just let me know if you got your e-ticket for the AP test today. And yeah, so that's the deal. All right, couple reminders here. Do not activate that e-ticket on test day unless you got the device you're going to use. So if you're going to type on a Chromebook or computer, don't go click on your phone, because guess what? You're going to have to scroll back and forth and try to do a DBQ on your phone, and that is not a good thing. Also, it is really important. It is really important. Notice I use the teacher voice. You need to give yourself enough time for the upload. From what I've been hearing, the kids who've had a hard time uploading, well, they're trying to hit submit and upload with like a minute or two left. Give yourself that time. I told you guys, if you go a little bit past that 45-minute mark, like a minute, fine. But, you want to have time for that upload button. It's really, really important, guys. Again, you need to be there logged on at 1:30. That's a half an hour before the test. They're going to have some kind of screening questions. I don't know what that means, but the whole idea is they're going to verify that you are who you say you are, and probably something about like, they want to be able to analyze how you write or something like that, so they can tell if, all of a sudden you tag out some college kid or something. I don't know. Not to use any shared Google Docs. If you have information on a Google Doc, that's fine. Just make sure it's unique to you. It's not shared with anybody else. I honest to God recommend, guys, if you can print, I had you make those one-page study guides for each time period. Have them printed out. And then all of a sudden on test day, if you go, oh, this DBQ is from period 4, boom, get period 4 right there. Okay? That's really what I would recommend doing. Again, make sure you eat lunch. Make sure that you've talked to your parents ahead of time about, Mom, you got to leave me alone. Don't let my dork little brother come in and bother me. If the dog barks, someone else got to take care of it. Go to the bathroom first, because if you have a bathroom break, the clock is running. Okay? So you have to do that stuff. You have to go through like their screening process before you're allowed to take the test. And again, you have 45 minutes to write it, 5 minutes to upload that sucker. And then all of a sudden, life will be better. You'll hear birds chirping. Everything will be in color. Food will taste good again. It'll stop being, ridiculously freezing cold and everything. And we'll have summer. Okay? And hey, we get spring break after another week. The week of Memorial Day. So, hey, what the heck? Why not? All right. So, we're talking about historians, books, pop culture, and other stuff for context and outside information. Okay? If you have the ability to follow along at home, do so. Originally I was going to do checks and balances and stuff like that. Well, I have that up there, so you can certainly access that tomorrow. I was just thinking, I said to myself, this might be a good thing for the kids. All right, first things first, let's talk about period 3. Remember, this year's test goes from 1754 to 8, which is the beginning of period 3, up through 1945, which is the end of period 7. Okay, the DBQ prompt will be somewhere in there. You are allowed to go outside the time period, to help with context or that little extra analytical point, make a connection across time periods. So you can do something from period 1 or 2. Those of you who remember the couple little things we did for 8 and 9, you're allowed to use that. Obviously, make those connections based upon what you know best. Okay? All right. Big stuff here. If I can, I gave you a reference to a historian that we read or we just kind of discussed. I tried to find a video for you. In period 3, there's a historian who can help you for contextualization, who can help you get that analytical point. His name is Charles Beard. Okay? And I put a video up there about Charles Beard. Charles Beard's a historian from the Progressive Era. You should remember the Progressive Era by now. 1890 to about 1917. That's the time period of Teddy Roosevelt and the Muckrakers. It's when America was obsessed with, let's reform all the abuses and problems from the industrial system. Now, think of it this way: historians get biased, historians get influenced by the events and the ideas around them, just like everybody else does. So, since Beard is a historian during the progressive era, when everybody's focused on economic issues and economic reforms, his point of view, his bias, what's the English teacher thing, the lens he looks at history through is going to have a very economic kind of bias to it. Proof. Beard's most famous book is called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. And basically, according to Charles Beard, in his different books he's written, everything in American history that he had studied, you can trace back to economic issues. According to Beard, in period 3, if you look at the American Revolution, the primary motivation, according to Beard, was this idea of economic issues. Now, let's try to give some examples of that. Most of the founding fathers, if you look at them, well, all of them, they're rich dudes. A lot of them were merchants, businessmen who were not doing well, or as well as they should be, under mercantilism. Hey, hit me up in the comments. Your first question of the night. Who was the guy who presided over the Continental Congress, who had the really big signature on the Declaration of Independence? Because he was a famous Boston merchant. Give me his answer, and that's our first kind of like, hey, you got your answer on there. See how much of a time-lapse delay there is. Gracie, good job. John Hancock, okay. Now, Hancock, in fact, was not only a Boston merchant, he got busted by the British for smuggling, so he's definitely got an axe to grind. If you look at other people, some of you guys over the summer read for me His Excellency George Washington. And one of the lessons we learned was Washington was really smart. Washington realized that under mercantilism, the colonists were always getting left behind. Washington was smart enough to realize that under mercantilism, I sell my tobacco, but the way it worked was you couldn't sell it directly to the British. You had to have a British agent do it for you. So Washington had this company, Carrying Company, do it. Well, Carrying Company would sell Washington's tobacco for X number of pounds a bushel, but then they would cut a commission off the top. So Washington would never get the price he could get. Oh, by the way, under mercantilism, you're not allowed to go sell to other countries. Washington would then tell Carrying Company, I need you to buy me stuff. Buy me clothing, buy me dishes, buy me a present for my wife, whatever. Well, Carrying Company would get the stuff, but they would tack on a fee there. So, Washington was smart enough to realize, hey, look, we're getting hammered both ways. So what Washington did was he converted Mount Vernon. He moved away from being dependent upon tobacco and instead grew rye and other grains, corn. In fact, what do you do with that rye and corn? You make whiskey. George Washington became the largest distiller of whiskey in America. He had a fleet of small fishing boats. He had a blacksmith shops for making like iron nails and things like that. And he was smart enough to realize that. Another good example is Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson has economic problems because A, he's a shopaholic, but B, same idea. Can't get a great price for his tobacco. And then on the flip side, whenever he goes into shopaholic mode, he's paying more. Okay? And if you think about it, the fact that there's taxes, that's an economic issue. How do the colonists fight back against the British? They use boycotts and non-importation agreements. They put pressure on British businesses, and the British businesses are the ones who go banging on the door of Parliament and say, hey, repeal these taxes. So Beard would argue, look, you're looking at mercantilism and the enforcement of it, and the fact that under mercantilism, the colonies always kind of come out in second place. There's an economic reason for the revolution. The other big thing Beard's going to point to in period 3 is the economic motives for the Constitution. America was broke. America was millions and millions of dollars in debt, not just to countries like France, but to private individuals. And the problem was a lot of kind of speculators, kind of sly businessmen, guys like Hamilton, some of his associates, they were going around and they were saying, hey, listen, I see you have all these IOUs from the Continental Congress. You think you're ever actually going to get paid back? Let me buy them off you for 20 cents on the dollar. Well, it's these guys who now have purchased all these IOUs, according to Beard, that they want to take care of because these wealthier people, they want to make sure that they have their faith in the government. One of the big things about governments even today is The fastest way to have a government fall apart and have anarchy is if people feel like the government can't honor its debts. So again, Beard points out that one of the primary motives for making the Constitution was to make sure that you had a government that could pay off its debts. In fact, it's in there. It's part of what's called the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, Article 5 or 6, which basically says, look, all debts incurred under the Articles of Confederation will be paid off. Okay, if we look at that motivation more, who came up with, after the Constitution, in the Washington administration, who came up with an assumption plan to say, we're going to assume the debts of all the states, and we'll make sure that all debts, whether the federal government debts and state debts, are paid off by the federal government? Hit me in the comments for that. Who came up with an assumption plan to say we're going to assume all the state debts, we'll pay off those debts? Bennett, Zach, Liv, good job. Hamilton. Okay, now in period 3, let's get away from historians because, quite frankly, now we're getting bored. Okay, in period 3 and in all these time periods, we can find different examples of literature, of pop culture. Why do we care about that? Because when you're doing your contextualization, whether it's the big context of the essay, or maybe you're trying to frame, again, your hippo skills, you're trying to frame the context of a document. I was explaining to one of you guys this morning, what do I mean by context? Okay. Have you ever, snapped at somebody? Something innocent happened and you kind of bit their head off a little bit, said something mean, or you kind of sent a nasty text to them, and then your friend or family member is kind of like, yo, what's up with that? And then you say, well, look, I'm sorry, it wasn't you. I was upset because my mom yelled at me. I got a cruddy grade in math class, and this other kid was a jerk, and I left my homework for chemistry at home. You're providing context to explain why you snapped. Well, when we look at a document, if we're doing contextualization, if we're doing the historical context, we're trying to say, here's what's going on. This is why the doggone document was made. Let me explain why it was made so that the document will make sense. And we do that by giving specific things, hitting those little word and bold, those vocab things. So, important books during period 3 that you could use. You got something called Thomas Paine writing Common Sense. Okay. Remember, that's just a pamphlet. Thomas Paine, though, sells more copies than anything in America except for the Bible. You got a famous poet during period 3, a woman named Phyllis Wheatley, who is an African-American poet. She's a former slave. You've got a series of essays written in support of the Constitution called the Federalist Papers. Hey, hit me up in the comments. There's three authors of the Federalist Papers. Give me one of them. If you give me one, you've shown me you're awake here. Who are some of the big authors of the Federalist Papers, guys? Gracie, good job. Liv, love it. Come on, guys. Who else? Bennett. Yep, there's one more big one. We got John Jay. Good job, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. Good job, El Presidente. And again, these are important because they're the 85 essays. They're kind of like commercials to persuade people to support the ratification of the Constitution. All right, moving along here. Other bits of artwork, music, literature. If you happen to see a document, a painting, there's 2 famous painters during period 3. One is a guy named Benjamin West. And the one painting I would say that could pop up is West did a painting showing the Paris Peace Treaty being signed. And it shows the 5-member American delegation. And then it stops, like the painting's not finished. And it leaves off, the French and the British. And the symbolism behind it is because it wasn't finished, there's unresolved issues. Charles Wilson Peale, the other one, I think he did a lot of stuff with George Washington. Just if you see the name, I don't want you to freak out. All right. moving along, continuing into period 3, not as much pop culture that's really going to be great for you, but we can do a lot of connections to other time periods. To get that other analytical point, the easiest way to do it, and probably the way that's most recognizable for the grader, is to take a document from period 3 or take a piece of outside info that you just hammered and go, what's going on here is eerily similar to something from another time period. So let's do this. Hypothetically speaking, let's say you get a document that, here's comments time, so get your typing fingers ready. Let's say you get a document that shows the Boston Massacre. Maybe you see Paul Revere's engraving that shows it. Can you think of something similar to the Boston Massacre of 1770? Here's a hint. I sent you with this date in history. The anniversary of it happened on May 4th. So give me something. And if you have a different one, that's fine. But the Boston Massacre, where the British soldiers opened up fire, they killed 5 Americans, members of the Sons of Liberty. Zach, great job. 200 years later, in 1970, you get a shooting at a place called Kent State University. Anti-war protesters, people protesting against the Vietnam War. The Ohio National Guard gets called in. We don't know to this day what happened, except for the fact that the National Guard opened up fire and they killed 4 of the protesters. Now, why do we care? Because both with Kent State and the Boston Massacre, 200 years apart, they did a lot to really kind of create propaganda and turn public opinion to one particular side. With the Boston Massacre, remember Paul Revere made the engraving of the silver plate that showed the massacre. And we said that the massacre itself was more kind of like a shoving match that got out of control. And to this day, it wasn't so much like an order to fire, but the soldiers panicked. Well, Kent State, we don't actually know what happened, but what we do know is the soldiers opened fire. And again, 4 protesters were killed, 9 others were injured. Sam Adams for the Boston Massacre, he's the one who actually came up with the term, and it became like a thing that spread throughout the country. Well, Kent State in 1970, it really changed the minds of a lot of Americans. Prior to Kent State, there were still a lot of Americans kind of felt like, the anti-war protesters were like that kind of weirdo fringe. They weren't patriotic. And now all of a sudden, when you're seeing college kids getting mowed down, that even started to bring the older generation over. Okay. There was a song by this rock and roll guy named Neil Young. He's on all the old classic rock stations. And he made a song called Ohio. And the lyrics go, hey, if I'm still on, can you guys, someone just type "you're here" in the comments? All of a sudden, my internet went all wonky here. So I'm hoping right now one of you is going to type in, hey, yeah, you're here, Ash. We can see you. Cool. All right, good. All right. So that's one connection you can make. All right. Another connection you can make. Let's say you're actually doing something and you got a document about the revolution, about the battles. Okay. You could talk about Washington military strategy. George Washington, he used what was called a Fabian strategy. Now, that's a really fancy term, which basically was you don't have to win, just don't lose. Washington actually lost more battles than he won. His strategy was run away really well. George Washington's greatest moments were, we're going to lose New York. Run away. Don't get caught. So hit, live to fight another day. You might lose, but live to fight another day. The idea being that sooner or later, maybe the British are going to go, this isn't worth it. In fact, really, that's why we won the revolution. It wasn't so much that we beat the British. The British never sent all of their might. They kind of fought with one hand tied behind their back. But as time went on, the war became more expensive and public opinion turned against it. So now synthesize me. Make the connection, baby. Find another example of in American history where an underdog won a victory in a war over a superpower by using hit and run kind of strategies, or some might say guerrilla warfare. Type that sucker in the comments for me. Rob, Garrett, Alex, awesome job. Vietnam, yeah. During Vietnam, we see the use of guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong, who was the communist guerrillas in Vietnam, they never really fought us head on. Their strategy was don't lose. In fact, I remember in college I read an article by the North Vietnamese commander, this guy General, oh golly, Giap, I think it was Giap, and he did this whole thing, a metaphor. How does the tiger hunt the elephant? He doesn't charge the elephant. He hides in the bushes. He slashes. He runs away. And then he comes back later when the elephant's not looking. He slashes him, and he basically waits until the elephant gets tired, bleeds to death, and is too tired to fight. Same idea. Keep the war prolonged, never really lose. Just you don't have to win, and make the war expensive, make the war costly, make it unpopular. All right. Other bits of synthesis. We know George Washington is the first president of the United States. He gets elected in 1789. He serves all the way up through 1797. He creates America's first foreign policy. Remember, the thing about Washington is if you're going to use Washington as president, if you get a document about President Washington, the whole big thing is the word precedence. He's the one who sets the examples. What foreign policy does George Washington create as a precedent for later American presidents? I'll sit here and rock while I wait for your comment. Yeah, great job, guys. Neutrality. All right, now, so Washington sets this foreign policy of neutrality. Finish me off here. This is very similar to another time period in American history where other American presidents wrestled with this idea of using neutrality. Name another time period. There's a whole bunch you could use. Okay. I did not type, is Washington the best president? That is really, really weird. I don't know who did that. I think my YouTube got hacked. Because you guys know I wouldn't type, is Washington the best president, right? All right, Bennett. I would not say the Cold War. In fact, if you really think about it, Bennett, everything from after World War II, which is really mainly the Cold War, is not an example of neutrality because we're going to fight communism. We're going to stop the spread of it. But can you give me another time period in American history where other American presidents tried and struggled to do the idea of, hey, we're not going to take sides, we're going to stay neutral? All right, I got Sarah telling me Woodrow Wilson with World War I. Yeah. In fact, in 1916, Wilson ran for re-election. His campaign slogan was, he kept us out of war. Okay. Zach, FDR. Now, let's kind of put some quotes here, Zach. Did FDR pass the Neutrality Acts, or did Congress do that? But FDR realized, look, he couldn't get full-fledged support. So as Zach points out, and Zach, that's a really good analysis, FDR tried to ease America away from neutrality. He tried little tests. One was called the quarantine speech, where he said, look, fascism, it's kind of like a disease, and sometimes you got to keep the disease from spreading. Let's see here. Hannah, Wilson's presidency, yes. World War I. Logan, French Revolution. Well, Logan, be more specific. I love your answer. Name a president or name a situation where the French Revolution caused America to have to be neutral, besides G-dubs, by the way, because that's when it happened. But name a president who, after Washington, struggled to keep America neutral because of the French Revolution. Bennett, the XYZ affair. Good. Who's the president for the XYZ affair and what we call the quasi-war with France? Hint, he's still in period 3. Good job, John Adams. Now, go into period 4, Thomas Jefferson. He struggles with neutrality because Britain and France were at war. He wanted to keep America neutral so he could trade, but the British were kidnapping our sailors. Type it in if you remember that word. What's that word we use for when the British were kidnapping American sailors, forcing them to be in the British Navy? Come on, guys. You know this. Come on, impress me. I'm still wondering how the heck somebody typed in it. This is really weird. I am not typing this stuff. I think I've been hacked, or one of my kids at home is trying to mess with my head. They're telling me I'm number one. They're saying Washington's the best president. I mean, you guys know I love G-dubs, but we know who the real best president is. Gracie, good job. Impressment. So now, here's my next question for the comments, guys. What was Thomas Jefferson's epic fail, his big mistake? When he was trying to stay neutral and the British were impressing our ships, and it was hard to do that, Jefferson responded to French actions and British actions by doing this. And instead, good job, Bennett, the Embargo Act of 1807. We said that was Jefferson's big fail. It didn't teach the British or the French a lesson. It didn't hurt them. Instead, what section of the economy got hurt? What section of the country, I should say, got hurt by Jefferson's Embargo Act, peeps? North, south, east, west, mid-Atlantic, coastal, Chesapeake, New England. I mean, just tell me what section. Not the South. Remember, the South is, more still plantation. But what part of the North, Rob, be more specific, was really relying on shipping and trade going all the way back to colonial times? And they didn't like the War of 1812. They weren't so patriotic. In fact, New England. Good job, Rob. Okay. So if we talk about, neutrality with Washington, we can go to Adams with a quasi-war with France. We could talk about Jefferson with the Embargo Act and trying to, what led up to the War of 1812. We could talk about Wilson at the beginning of World War I, FDR and Congress passed the Neutrality Acts prior to World War II. And we can say World War II really put the nail in the coffin for neutrality, because after World War II, you don't see that in America anymore. In fact, we see the opposite, like the Cold War. We see us getting involved to fight communism. One more. Let's see here. Washington, of course, gave his farewell address, wrote it, published it in newspapers, said, that's it. I'm only going to serve two terms. And again, the idea is it was a precedent. It was an example set by Washington for other presidents. And that precedent was going to last until what later president, my peeps? Who finally broke Washington's two-term precedent? Good, FDR. Now, FDR got elected to 3 and 4 terms. What was the factor that allowed FDR to get elected to a 3rd and a 4th term, guys? Tell me why. What was the big event that made the American people go, fine, we'll let you get away with this. We'll elect you to a 3rd term because we don't want to change leaders. We're afraid to. Good job, guys. World War II. Now, FDR died 82 days into his 4th term. You can no longer have a president serve more than 2. Today, what prevents a president from serving more than two terms? Good job, Ben, the 22nd Amendment. That's why I do that thing. Okay. So, just some synthesis connections for period 3. Moving along, if you're following and playing the home version, we've got period 4, 1800 to 1848, what I've always called the age of Jefferson to the age of Jackson. The idea that now America's starting to try to grow up and figure out what it means to be America, the Republic. We get a lot of nationalism, I heart my country. We also get a lot of sectionalism where the country gets divided up. We have questions about who's a citizen, who should be allowed to vote. We got a lot of new Americans moving in. We also get a lot of Americans moving west, manifest destiny, okay? And we start to see more and more of that road toward the Civil War. If I'm going to make references to historians, I have a video on this Google slide you might want to watch. Frederick Jackson Turner. Now, Frederick Jackson Turner wrote what's now known as the Frontier Thesis in the late 1800s, really more in what we call period 6. But he's relevant because, according to Turner, the fact that we always had a Western frontier made America more democratic. He points to the fact that it was, the Western states that removed the property restriction on voting. It was the Western states who first began to say, look, your electoral votes will be determined by your popular vote. Later, it's the Western states, by the way, who give women suffrage first. He points to the fact that we always had a West caused Americans to be more like individualistic. Think about it. In America, we like to be kind of spaced out, spread out. He points to the fact that Western expansion forced more ingenuity. Look at a lot of the great inventions that come because of the frontier. Okay. So you could reference Turner if you are talking about what concept. What's the big idea? When we talk about Western expansion, if you're going to reference Turner, you could say, hey, look, this ties directly in with the philosophy of, come on. What's the big philosophy I want to hear, guys? Yeah, manifest destiny. If I say manifest destiny, you say, go west, young man, go west. Now, again, in period 4, it's a time of growing American nationalism. And there's two kinds of nationalism, really. We see cultural nationalism, books and art and stuff like that. We also see economic nationalism. I think last week we talked about like Henry Clay and the American system. But I jotted down a couple examples of cultural nationalism. First of all, there's this guy, Noah Webster. He creates a dictionary of American words. Why? American English. They want to kind of like, we want to distinguish ourselves from Great Britain. For you baseball players, center field is spelled C-E-N-T-E-R. But if you were playing in jolly old England, center is C-E-N-T-R-E. Okay. Another good example is this guy, Washington Irving. He writes stories that are unique to America. You've probably heard of a couple of them. One is about a guy who takes a 20-year nap, Rip Van Winkle. Another is the legend about this headless horseman. Okay? So uniquely American stories. We also see one of the first real uniquely American styles of art. Now, if America's obsessed with manifest destiny and going west and the frontier and nature, what was the name of that genre, that school of art that emphasized nature and landscapes, and mankind is like this big compared to the awesomeness and power of nature? Nature almost has like this supernatural quality, and you guys are blowing the comments up. I love it. This idea of the Hudson River School. Good. Okay. The idea that, landscapes, you don't need people. If people are in the paintings, they're insignificant. Emphasis on the frontier, stuff like that. Okay. So again, that's a nice little thing you could put in there for a little extra context, or at least outside information if you're writing about manifest destiny. All right. Period 4, connections. And guys, again, you could come up with a lot more than I did. I tried to put these together as fast as I could. But if you're looking to connect stuff from period 4 to other time periods, War of 1812 happens in period 4. The number one reason we fought the War of 1812 against the British was they were taking away our freedom of the seas. The British were stopping American ships and kidnapping or impressing American sailors, forcing them to work for the British. They were not letting us stay neutral. Can you guys give me another example of another time period when we got involved in a war because our freedom of the seas was being taken away? When we were trying to be neutral, but another country was stopping our ability to safely travel the oceans. Waiting for you in the comments, guys. Because again, to get that little analytical point, we want to make a point, connect it to a document or outside information, but then give like a good 3 sentences. And you blew me up. World War I. Hey, give me an example of how freedom of the seas was being taken away during World War I. Give me one word. Come on. One word to prove the idea that our freedom of the seas was being taken away. Don't be a loser. Okay, Garrett, what do those submarines do? The old saying, loose lips sink ships. Submarines did something, Liv. What'd they do? Name a ship that got sunk by submarines. Like I said, don't be a bunch of losers. Ironically, yes, Rob, good job. The Lusitania. Ironically, the Lusitania was owned by the White Star Line, the same company that owned the Titanic. They were sister ships. Yikes. Okay. Other synthesis connections. The Monroe Doctrine in 1823. By the way, while I talk, one of you guys is going to type in, tell me who the actual author of the Monroe Doctrine was, because we know he was not James Monroe. Well, anyway, the Monroe administration issues this doctrine in 1823 and says, hey, Europe, stay out of the West. Don't interfere. Don't try to start new colonies. Don't try to take back the ones you lost. And really, there's not a whole lot of reaction for the rest of the world. In fact, the Monroe Doctrine, which is really an example of isolation. The Monroe Doctrine really doesn't kind of become relevant. Good job, Logan. It was John Quincy Adams. Until the late 1800s, when it becomes like the basis for American imperialism. What can you connect the Monroe Doctrine to later on? So if the Monroe Doctrine said, hey, Europe, stay out of the West, don't interfere, give me something from a time later in American history that connects to the Monroe Doctrine. Think about who my favorite president is. Good job, Wolfpack. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, a.k.a. big stick diplomacy. Now Teddy comes and says, hey, Europe, stay out. There were European countries like England that were threatening to take over Caribbean nations until they paid off their debts. Teddy said, no. You stay out. We're going to take them over. We will take them over until they pay off their debts to you. You guys stay out. And the whole idea of the Roosevelt corollary was this idea of intervention, that the United States will intervene in Latin American affairs anytime. I am James. I know the account. I'm thinking my two older sons are messing with me, telling me my 6-year-old's doing this. Okay. But anytime you talk about that, Teddy says, look, we can intervene. Okay. You could even kick it even further. We didn't get to do this year, and I'm kind of bummed out because it was one of my favorite things to teach, the idea of the Cuban Missile Crisis under JFK. In 1962, October of 1962, the Soviet Union tries to put nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. They're violating the Monroe Doctrine. Oh, and by the way, pointing nukes at us. Okay. Andrew Jackson's campaign tactics. When we talked about Andrew Jackson this year, we said Jackson invented a new campaign style because now the common man could vote. Because remember, the property restriction was removed, but also because now the popular vote would determine the electoral vote. So what does Jackson do? He and his campaign, they perfect the art of going around shaking hands, kissing babies. Jackson campaign rallies, barbecues and booze, and lots of name calling and mudslinging. And give me a connection to another time in history when politicians used Andrew Jackson type campaign tactics. And please be as specific as you possibly can. Remember, we need like vocab, word, and boldy type things. Wolfpack, yes, President Trump. Give me an example, though, because again, you can't just say, this is similar to when Donald Trump ran. You got to give me, Helena, Jake, Liv, give me an example of something that President Trump did when he ran for president in 2016 that, would be like a word and boldy type of thing, or a quote, or something specific. Jacksonian campaign tactics. We did a Davy Crockett document in Zoom the other day. The idea that, you're going to make a promise. All right, Logan, yes. Calling his opponent Crooked Hillary. Liv, Jake, yes. I'm going to build a wall. It's going to be the greatest wall of all time. I want it out of steel, but we'll make it see-through. And who's going to pay for it? Gino, yes. Doing the lock her up chant, too. Yeah. Those are Jacksonian campaign tactics. Issues? What issues? Oh, yeah. I'm going to build a wall, and Mexico's going to pay for it. And what? You're criticizing me? Well, that's typical. It's Crooked Hillary. It's her dirty campaign tactics. Very similar. Not being political, but being real here about history here. Very similar to Jacksonian campaign tactics. Second Great Awakening. All those religious reforms, the increase of emotion and revivalism, and the splitting up into new Protestant churches and all the reforms, people question authority. What could you compare the Second Great Awakening to? Please don't overthink this. What would be a good connection to get that analytical point across time? Yeah, duh, the First Great Awakening. But wait, there's more. First Great Awakening takes you back to period 2, colonial times. Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, that famous Jonathan Edwards sermon, sinners in the hands of an angry God. When we go to the Second Great Awakening, we talk about how it leads to big societal reforms, though, because it's not good enough just to be a good Christian, but you're supposed to fight injustice and evil. And I think we just did this the other day. Can you go forward into another time period and say, there's a religious movement that leads to people trying to make societal reforms? Rob, good job. The social gospel movement. Okay. Jane Addams and Hull House, the settlement house movement, the creation of the YMCA. Okay, you could do that kind of stuff, cleaning up all the urban problems in America because city populations have exploded as a result of industrialization. So, moving right along, now we're in period 5. Cinco starts in 1844 because there's a presidential election. Hit me in the comments. What president got elected? Come on, poke that keyboard. What president got elected in 1844? And he starts period 5, and it ends in 1877. So tell me why 1844? Why 1877? Tell me that in the comments. Who gets elected in 1844? That gives us our start date for period 5. And what happens in 1877 that gives us our end date? Hit me in the comments. Who gets elected president in 1844? Good job, James K. Polk. But why 1877? Why is that the end date? Yes, Zach, it spans Polk to Hayes, but what's the big event in let's be real. No offense to Rutherford B. Hayes. Rest in peace, buddy. You're not a good job, guys. It's the Compromise of 1877 that pulls the Union Army out of the South and ends Reconstruction. So we said period 5 is basically its causes and effects of the Civil War. So if you're doing contextualization, everything you do in period 5 has to relate back to this idea of, dude, the Civil War is coming. Thanos is coming. And then we have to live with after the snap. Sorry, too soon? Mr. Stark, I don't feel so good. All right. What can we use? Historians. I know I'm a dork. We could go back to Charles Beard. Again, Beard would argue economic motives for the Civil War. Beard would say it's not states' rights. It's not slavery. But according to guys like Beard, it's going to be Jordan, too soon. I know. I still get a little, okay. You're going to get northern factory owners, northern industrialists versus southern plantation owners. Okay. So according to Beard, this is an economic war. This is a war of economic systems. Who's going to win? Industrial capitalism that's growing in the North, that the Republican Party favors, that the North favors, or southern plantation aristocracy and slavery that the Southern Democrats favor. Okay. Another historian, we all read this year a couple chapters from a book called The Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson, one of my favorite books. And we did a chapter called Mexico Will Poison Us. If you want to look through those notes, you might want to steal a quote or two. You also read a chapter called The Crime Against Kansas. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act is a really, really big deal. So you might want to, copy-paste onto your period 5 study guide a thing from that. Now, don't quote McPherson. Do not do that because that could get construed as plagiarism. But, look for a quick little reference. Oh, by the way, speaking of books, after the AP test, you know how we were going to do that big project, Roosevelt versus Roosevelt? We never got to. You guys have all the books. What's going to happen is I talked to Mrs. Trivison today. We're going to set up a table where after the AP test, you're going to bring those books back. And you can even bring your textbooks back too, get them out of the way. Because remember, most of you guys have either, books that belong to the library that our school librarian has to get back, not just to our school, but to other schools. And B, a lot of you guys have books that are my personal property that I bought, and I really want them back. So, the day after the AP test, go find my books. Find my Teddy Roosevelt books, find whatever books you have, Find your AP textbooks, and I will send an email out with instructions for that. But that's a story for another day. Okay. Back to period 5 here. So we have Battle Cry of Freedom. We can talk about Charles Beard. You could also go back to Frederick Jackson Turner, because remember, one of the big events in period 5 is the Mexican War and this question of manifest destiny. Other stuff. This is the time period Uncle Tom's Cabin is written. It's written, by the way, because of what? What piece of legislation spurred a lot of controversy and kind of inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin? Can you give me that one, guys? In the comments. And while you're doing that, there's another book you might want to Google. It's called The Impending Crisis of the South. It's this guy from the North who basically writes that slavery is hindering the economic development of the South. You could also reference those transcendentalists. Dude, can you name me a transcendentalist or two? You could talk about Henry David Thoreau with civil disobedience. You could talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson, the guy who gave the quote, "Mexico will poison us." Those are all good kind of pop culture things for outside information. Looking at other stuff. Songs. I played a bunch of songs for you during this time period. Rob, good job. Compromise of 1850, specifically the Fugitive Slave Act. That's why Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. I played a song called John Brown's Body by Pete Seeger this year. John Brown, if you remember, not only did he kill people like a whack job in Bleeding, Kansas, but he also started a slave rebellion, or tried to. In Harper's Ferry, Virginia, he attacked a federal weapons arsenal, was arrested, put on trial, convicted, and hanged. John Brown, we said, became a martyr to the abolitionist cause. So during the Civil War, when Union soldiers would go marching and, march for 15, 20 miles in a day, they would do all these songs as a way to kind of take your mind off the fact that your feet are bleeding. And one of the songs they would march to was called John Brown's Body. There's a song called The Battle Cry of Freedom. That's why McPherson wrote that book. Other stuff, literature, abolitionist literature. Hey, hit me up real fast. Who wrote The Liberator? And who wrote The North Star? Both are famous abolitionist newspapers that you could use. And we'll talk about synthesis. What abolitionist wrote The Liberator and what abolitionist wrote The North Star? Okay, Liv, good job. William Lloyd Garrison wrote The Liberator. Frederick Douglass wrote The North Star. Now let's do some synthesis connections. If I get to write, boy, I'll tell you what, I don't know how you guys feel, but in most years, kids really like it if they get a DBQ about period 5, especially Kansas, Nebraska Act or Fugitive Slave Act kind of stuff. There's a lot of easy synthesis connections. For one thing, the Mexican War, it's a win. Yay, America. We get all this territory, but it's going to lead to all kinds of big controversies like the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act. The Mexican War increases the debate over slavery, and actually the victory in the Mexican War is one of the main causes of the Civil War. Make a connection to another time period. Can you think of another time in American history when a victory in one war had problems afterward that led to America fighting in another war? Hit me in the comments. So Mexican War, it's a victory, but it causes the Civil War because of the problems that linger. Give me another time in American history. Garrett, yes, you could go World War I to World War II because we don't get involved in the League of Nations. We don't reject the Treaty of Versailles. Germany has to pay all the reparations. Give me another time in American history, though, when victory in a war causes so many economic problems that it actually leads to another war. Because the victory in the first war, yes, Garrett, the French and Indian War, the British win, but they're broke, which means they go away from salutary neglect. They pass the Quartering Act. They pass the Proclamation of 1763. They start the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act and the Townsend Acts. Explain that in 3-4 sentences. You just earned that second analytical point. All right. Mexican War was fought for the goals of territorial expansion. It was fought for the purpose of manifest destiny. We wanted to get California. Polk was dying. He was Jones, and he tried to buy California off of Mexico because Polk never got to annex Texas. The president before him, John Tyler, did it right before he could. So Polk's dying. He wants to annex Texas. So the goal is to get territory, and the result of the Mexican War is a gigantic territorial acquisition, huge amounts of land that we call the Mexican Cession. Modern-day California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. Go to another time period. When we fight a war, clearly because we are Jones and we want territory, and then after the war, we get a huge amount of territory. And maybe tell me what that territory was. What's the other war in American history where we fight it because we want to expand our empire, and as a result, we get a bunch of territories? The Spanish-American War. Good job, Rob. Garrett, good job. Yeah, and follow up. We got Puerto Rico. We got the Philippines. So again, we go from manifest destiny to imperialism. Both wars fought with the goal of we want territory. Now, another big one. Mexican War has a lot of opposition to it. There are people who protest against it. There are people who speak out against it. That chapter in Battle Cry of Freedom is called Mexico Poisonous. That's a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous transcendentalist. Henry David Thoreau, the other really big famous transcendentalist, he writes an essay called Civil Disobedience. Why? Thoreau went to jail for one night because he refused to pay his taxes, because he didn't want to support the government and their war to basically spread slavery. Give me another example of a war in American history that led to significant protest, and maybe an example of that protest. Gino, great job. Vietnam. Now, can you give me a specific example of an anti-war protest in Vietnam? Jake got me Vietnam too. Can someone give me an example of, okay, here's an example of one of those protests, because you're almost there, where in the Mexican War, Thoreau spent a night in jail, wrote Civil Disobedience. Emerson gave that quote, Mexico Poisonous. Abraham Lincoln, remember, had the spot resolution, show me the spot where supposedly Mexico started this. Hint, if you don't tell me soon, you're going to force me to play the song. You know the song. The 18-minute long song that we played right before Thanksgiving. You know the song. Come on, finish me off here. He's staring at the comments like a hawk. Don't make me do it. I'll put that song on. I'll make you do like an assignment on that gosh darn song. Alice's Restaurant. Yeah, good job. Okay. All right. Moving on here. Other synthesis connections. Yeah, dude, period 5. Must be the middle child syndrome. You can connect it to everything. The reasons we got involved in the Mexican War were kind of dubious. Remember, Polk did the whole, I'm not touching you. Does this bug you? Does this bug you? Does this bug you thing? He had Zachary Taylor blockade the Rio Grande River. And then when fighting broke out, Polk went running to Congress saying, American blood's been spilled on American soil without provocation. Can you name another war in American history that we got involved in where one of the main reasons to justify it was kind of, hit me in the comments. Because there's a couple. There's one that we got to do. There's 2 others that I doubt you'll get, unless you're like a History Channel junkie like I am, that we didn't really get to do because of, the whole Corona thing. Yeah, Logan, good job. The Spanish-American War. Because we said Spain did something horrendous. What did we accuse Spain of doing? Hit me in the comments, guys. Because again, you're really describing this. You're making that connection across time periods. Hey, man, worst comes to worst. They're giving, they blew up the USS Maine. The quote was, remember the Maine, the hell with Spain. Okay? Hey, by the way, who exaggerated the stories and kind of pinned the sinking of the Maine on Spain? What'd you call those newspaper dudes? I know I'm asking a lot of you. Yellow journalists. Good job. All right, give you another one here. During period 5, the fugitive slave law was so unpopular that in the North, people actually began going, states' rights. We have the right to refuse to obey the law. Well, in Syracuse, New York, in 1851, there was a slave, a runaway slave named Jerry Henry. He was grabbed in broad daylight by a bounty hunter, going to bring him back down south. And under the Fugitive Slave Act, they were supposed to cooperate with him. Jerry Henry was put in a cell in downtown Syracuse until arrangements could be made to bring him back. Lucky for Jerry Henry, Syracuse was one of the biggest abolitionist towns in America. And they had the famous Jerry Rescue. They busted him out of jail. They made him, poof, disappear. People broke the law to fight back against something that they knew was wrong or they felt strongly about. Name another time in American history when people knowingly got together, broke the law because they said, this is not right. Hit me in those comments. You guys have been awesome tonight, by the way. You folks are on the mark. Yeah, the Boston Tea Party. You know, we don't want to pay the taxes for the Tea Act, so Boston's going to have a tea party tonight, okay? Let's see here. Going into period 6. Hey, there's that Frederick Jackson Turner guy again. Why? Because we have the closing of the Old West. You know, this is when we talked about like the Dawes Severalty Act and the massacre at Wounded Knee. We talked about the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And the fact is, late 1800s, because period 6, remember, is 1865 to 1898. This is actually when Turner wrote the Frontier Thesis. Some books. Helen Hunt Jackson writes A Century of Dishonor. That really exposes the horrible treatment policies of the U.S. government. It leads to people to say, we should do something. And it leads to Congress to pass a law that was supposed to help Native Americans, in fact, made their situation worse because the idea was to abolish the tribal system. What's the name of the law that was passed kind of partially as a result of Helen Hunt Jackson's book, A Century of Dishonor? That is how I said partially. Called the Dawes Act, Rob, or more specifically the Dawes Severalty Act. But if on Friday you write the Dawes Act, you're fine. Pop culture. People would write these things called dime novels, which are kind of like roided up versions of what we now call comic books. The most famous author of dime novels was this guy. He wrote a lot of rags to riches stories. That was his big theme. The idea that if you're smart enough and you work hard enough, well, doggone it, you can become rich and powerful. A lot about frontier people who are brave. What was the name of this guy? Because he's really nice to use if you're contextualizing period 6, which is the age of big business. Horatio Alger. Good job, Zach. All right. Moving on here. Art tells us a lot about time periods. During period 6, again, it's the age of industrialization. It's the age of big business, which means industrialization is going to lead to urbanization. Cities are growing too fast. They have all kinds of problems. Cities are down and dirty. They're fast. They're furious. What's the name of that school of art, that genre of art that depicted urban, gritty scenes? You know, not portraits, not supernatural, not landscapes, not make it pretty, but it's an example of what's called realism. Paint it for what it is. City life is dirty, it's vibrant, it's fast, energetic. Good job, Gracie. The Ashcan School. That's awesome contextualization. It's also a time where, because of industrialization, again, see how always go back to because of industrialization, you have the growth of these corporations. Corporations don't just have the grunts and the owners. They have to have the middle managers, the white collar folks. So you get the growth of a middle class. And now that you have more and more of this growth of middle class, you get the development of what's called the leisure culture. People have money, and in their free time, they want to spend it and do things. So professional sports, Major League Baseball starts during this time period, in period 6. The first college football game was played between those perennial football powers, Rutgers and Harvard, in 1869. Bare knuckle boxing was popular Okay. Um, so you have sports, you have variety shows called vaudeville shows where people would sing and dance, do all kinds of things. All right, synthesis connections. Again, period six, guys, is the age of big business. It's what we call the Gilded Age. It's the age of trust, monopolies, robber barons, The Rock, and Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan. So if we make connections, um, Gilded Age. During the Gilded Age, the government's economic policy we know was very pro-business. You could kind of say laissez-faire, very corporate friendly. Name another decade in American history, another time period in American history that was incredibly pro-business. You know, looser regulations. Hit me in the comments, peeps. Come on, you're doing awesome. Good job, Rob. The 20s. Remember, in the 1920s, you have Warren Harding elected with that return to normalcy. According to Harding, progressive and government getting involved and Teddy and trust busting. That's not normal America. Let's wind things back to the good old days of laissez-faire. Hey, what American president in the 1920s gave the famous quote, "The business of America is business," because that's a good connection. Now you're explaining that connection between the Gilded Age and the 20s, and that's what you have to do. You can't just say, "Oh, this is very similar to the 20s." Remember, you got to build this up in 3 or 4 sentences. What American president said, "The business of America is business"? Coolidge. So Coolidge backed off regulations on a lot of businesses. He cut taxes for the wealthy. What's that economic theory called? That if you cut taxes on the wealthy, they're going to invest that money and spend it, which will lead to people buying more stuff, which will lead to companies hiring more people, which means those workers have jobs, and that even poor people will benefit by giving the rich more money. Yes, trickle down economics, which, by the way, that's the economic policy of Ronald Reagan. Well, Ronald Reagan. In fact, they called it, with Reagan's Act, they called it voodoo economics. So be careful. The term voodoo economics is exclusive to Reagan. Ironically, the guy who gave that name was during the 1980 presidential primary. It was Papa Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. When he was debating Reagan, he talked about that's voodoo economics. Not gonna do it. Wouldn't be prudent at this juncture. It's a bad George Herbert Walker Bush impression, by the way. All right. In the Gilded Age, people really began to espouse this idea of the Protestant work ethic, the idea that if you're rich, clearly that means you're a hard worker and you're a good person, that wealth is a sign of piety or holiness. Can you name another time period in American history when people tried to say, well, material wealth is a sign that God's on your side? Or a specific group of people who would try to claim that in another time period? Come on, hit me in the comments. We're almost done. You guys, by the way, again, are phenomenal. Kicking butt, man. We should have taken the test today. So again, if you get a document during the Gilded Age, and they're talking about this idea of the Protestant work ethic, that wealth is a sign of your hard work, wealth is a sign of your prosperity, you could go back in time, to colonial times, to New England, to Massachusetts, because the Puritans believed in this thing called predestination. And the Protestant work ethic, as it was called, was originally kind of known as like the Puritan work ethic. The Puritans believed that hard work was a sign that you were one of God's chosen, one of his elect, and that also, if God's already decided who's going to heaven or hell, wouldn't he give the holy people more wealth? You could connect economic changes and growth in the Gilded Age to the market revolution. Why? Because the market revolution is America's early industrialization. During the market revolution, you have this thing called the transportation revolution. Better roads, canals, the steamboat. We'll now go to the Gilded Age, and there's a new transportation revolution because what one specific industry is everywhere, spreads out like an octopus. It's the railroads. Okay? Talk about how during the Gilded Age, if you get a document about the Sherman Antitrust Act or about the Interstate Commerce Commission, during the Gilded Age, you could point out that there were attempts to regulate trust, but they were largely ineffective. The ICC really had no teeth. It could only, like, say, you couldn't charge more for a short trip than a long trip, couldn't set maximum railroad rates. that the Sherman Antitrust Act was vaguely worded ineffective. In fact, that the ICC and the Sherman Antitrust Act were not really effective until the next time period, period 7. My boy, Teddy Roosevelt. In fact, it was the Sherman Antitrust Act that Teddy used to break up 43 trusts. All right, period 7. So much pop culture. Talk about the lost generation. Well, I should do this. You talk about muckrakers. By the way, if I say muckrakers, you say digging up the dirt. Upton Sinclair, Ida Tarbell, Jacob Riis, and what the muckrakers did, what legislation was passed because of them, who their targets were. Mention the fact that it was Teddy who named them. In the 20s, talk about authors, the lost generation, guys like F. Scott Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby, Ernest Hemingway, T.S. Eliot, H.L. Mencken. You could talk about the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes, the poet, Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, jazz music. The first silent films get created in the 20s. Charlie Chaplin, the famous silent film star. You could talk about music and entertainment during the Great Depression. I played for you, half a bazillion times a song called Brother, Can You Spare a Dime by Yip Harburg, which was like the anthem of the Great Depression. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that lyrics from that song as a document on either the Regents or the AP test. I played another song called Do Re Mi by Woody Guthrie about the Dust Bowl. Speaking of the Dust Bowl, boy, oh boy, George, tell me about the rabbits again, George. You could talk about John Steinbeck and Of Mice and Men, or his most famous book, The Grapes of Wrath. The impact of the WPA, the Works Progress Authority. The WPA is one of the most important New Deal programs. It had a WPA Federal Arts Project. Radio theater. I told you guys the story about how during the Great Depression, Orson Welles and the Mercury Radio Theater, they did a reenactment of War of the Worlds, and it caused a panic. World War II propaganda movies. I think I showed you some Three Stooges propaganda. Guys, it was during period 7 that there was this company called Timely Comics. Timely Comics created a comic book that was, America propaganda. Timely Comics later on became Marvel Comics. Captain America. Okay? Again, if you're doing comparison, you could compare trying to be neutral pre-World War I, or at least struggling to stay neutral to prior to World War II, to the War of 1812. And if you say neutrality, you darn well better go back old school to George Washington. You could compare and say, how ironic is this? Oh my gosh, what a great way to end an essay. If you're writing about in period 7 about how the United States refused to join the League of Nations, or if you have a document, save it right for the end, this document shows America's refusal to join the League of Nations, therefore the U.S. Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles, America did not want to be drawn into foreign wars. This is so ironic because just a few decades later, at the end of World War II, America would be the ones who would really lead the way to create the United Nations, a worldwide peacekeeping organization that, among other things, had the power to send troops, as they would do in the Korean conflict. You could talk about the role of women in World War I, World War II, kick it all the way back to the Civil War. Heck, kick it all the way back to the cult of Republican motherhood with Deborah Sampson, Molly Pitcher. Nativism, tons of nativism. You've got in the 1920s, the KKK, the Sacco and Vanzetti case, the National Origins Act, the Emergency Quota Act. You could talk about the Zoot Suit riots where in Los Angeles, American sailors attacked braceros, Mexican farm workers. I put a video on there. It's a really good, short, easy video. And immigration and nativism, that could be the topic Friday. It'll be 4 minutes of your life you won't regret. You could click that all the way back to the know-nothings in the 1850s. You could connect that to Japanese Americans being interned during World War II. There's so many connections you could make for period 7. Other connections. You've got the deals. You've got Teddy Roosevelt and the Square Deal. Talk about the 4 parts of that: trust busting, conservation, workers' rights, consumer protection. Compare that to Franklin Roosevelt, his cousin's New Deal, relief, recovery, reform. How both of them increase the role of the government to solve economic problems. Then what you could do is tomorrow you could look on one of the last slides in this Google slide, and it's got a little quick, I promise it's quick, History Channel video about Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, his Great Society. LBJ wanted to take the New Deal and make it bigger. In fact, his critics called it cradle to grave welfare. But Square Deal, New Deal, Great Society, all three of them increased the role of government in the economy. There's so many comparisons you can make. And as always, at the end of the Google slide, there's some dorkiness. There might be more than one bit of dorkiness, just to warn you, because I'm tired. And my wife is teasing me. She watched the video last night, and then she looked at the first video I made for you guys. Dude, the beard, the hair. Yeah, I'm about to go into witness protection program. No one's going to recognize me. I already sent the link out. You're invited if you want it. I got a Zoom at 10 a.m. tomorrow. I'll have another Zoom Friday at 10 a.m. Until then, if you need me for anything, I got a couple people I talked to. I did a couple one-on-one things on Google Hangouts. I'll do anything for you guys. So until then, log off and put away your chromies, homies. Miss you guys. I'll talk to you.